Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Andres Monroy. I'm a researcher here in Microsoft. And I have the pleasure to introduce Nancy Baim. She's a principal researcher in Microsoft Research New England in Boston, where we share. I was there for a year, so we worked together there. She's also a visiting professor at the MIT Department for Comparative Media Studies. She was formerly a professor at the Kansas University, not Kansas State. And so she moved to Microsoft, 3 years ago now, right? So we were lucky to have her join Microsoft Research. And so she's been writing about the internet for many, many years. Actually, I was looking at your publication record, and I saw a paper in 1993 talking about soap operas and Usenet, how people use discussion groups back then to talk about soap operas and so on. I was like, wow, I was in middle school. It's so impressive. Like, people were already thinking about these issues. And I'm sure, one of the things that I really admire about Nancy is the fact that she was one of the earliest scholars thinking about the implications of technology, especially the internet, in society. And I think maybe when you were starting, people were like, what, the internet, what is that? And today, obviously, this company is built around that, and tons of people interested in this. So I really admire her commitment to this particular topic. And today you see that she's well recognized by everyone as one of the most prominent scholars in this field. So without further ado, I have the pleasure to introduce Nancy.
Thank you, and thanks for showing up. There's so many more of you than I feared. It's funny that you said that in introducing me, because it is true that when I first started giving papers at academic conferences about the internet, you'd have like 15 minutes at a communication conference to give your whole paper, and I would literally spend the first 7 explaining the concept that computers could be used to talk to other computers and that there were humans actually doing this. And it blew people's minds. It was like 91, 92, they hadn't. It was fun times, I'll tell you that. So I just heard you saying, oh, the internet has changed so much, and it has, and that's what I want to talk about. So I wanted to start by asking how many of you saw this op-ed in the New York Times a few weeks ago? A few of you. Okay, this was a Sherry Turkle op-ed, and I see Sherry Turkle is coming to speak soon. In 2-3 weeks or 2-3 months, she's going to be. The date was up there. She's going to be giving this talk. Sherry has also been studying the internet for a very, very long time, and she has come to take a position that I think a lot of people identify with, which is, uh-oh, the internet is ruining everything. Our conversations are going to hell. Although in this case, she's not particularly as concerned with the internet as she is with cell phones and what cell phones are doing to our conversations. And I'll get back to that in a minute. But I wanted to highlight this article because it raised a lot of discussion, and a lot of people really identified with the concerns that she raises about what's happening to our conversations. Are we able to really pay attention to one another? Are we able to experience empathy in the same ways? I disagree with her conclusions about cell phones. I agree wholeheartedly with her conclusions about the value of conversation. Of course, it really ought to be titled, Stop Googling, Let's Bing. So I want us to think about interpersonal communication, which is the field that I come out of and the stance that I approach all of this from. So interpersonal communication is one of those things that's kind of invisible and yet obviously completely germane to our daily lives. It's those little moments where we're talking to each other, where we're communicating with each other one-on-one. Maybe there's a few of us. Maybe we're just bumping into each other in the hall. Maybe we're doing that thing that I think Turkle and many others mythologize, where we're looking deep into one another's eyes and having a communion of the souls, paying full attention with our whole selves once in a while. Most of the time, it's not very special. It's just the ordinary stuff of everyday life. Hey, did you get milk? Oh, hey, have you seen the stapler? Oh, which staples do you like? These work. I think the Slinger line works better than the whatever. It's the little things, but they add up. And they add up in a way that forms our personal relationships, our closest, our dearest, our most intimate, our arch enemies, all of them, our acquaintances, all of that. It adds up through this accretion of these little moments. And those little moments, as they accrete into relationships, also accrete into social norms, into a sense of this is how we as a society do things, right? We value these ways of treating people. We value these kinds of relationships. We value these connections with other people and these ways of doing it. So those social norms are really the underlying fabric of everyday communication, of everyday relationships, and of most social behavior. So what happens when the internet comes along is that they're all kind of thrown out of whack. And not just the internet, but mobile phones, mobile technology in general. Because social norms depend on knowing how to categorize things, what belongs where, because you treat things differently depending on which kind of thing it is. And if the boundaries have been disrupted, then you don't know anymore what's what. So new technologies provoke us because they blur the boundaries we've taken for granted. And in the book, I identify a number of the boundaries that get blurred. And what happens when these boundaries get blurred is that we have to rethink, okay, well, how should we be doing things? We could take it all for granted when it was invisible, but when a new technology comes along, suddenly it's visible. Somebody's walking around with a thing in front of their face. It's hard to not notice that it's there, right? So then we have to say, oh, we didn't walk around with things in front of our faces before. That was not a thing we did. What does it mean that we do that now? Is that okay? Right? So we have to rethink these norms. And that's where the tensions come up. So I think it's helpful to just get really concrete. And none of this is going to be news to any of you, but I think it's nonetheless helpful to get concrete about, well, what are these boundaries that are getting blurred? Time and space, the collapse of time and space is obviously a huge one. You go back to the very, very earliest communication technologies. Pretty much the oldest one is some bone scratchings, which they think were used to account for sort of how many grains did you get out of this bushel or whatnot. It was meant to transcend time and to transcend space, to allow messages to be conveyed to a place other than where they were spoken. And until the telegraph, that couldn't happen in real time. And I love these early ads. The USA is only a few minutes wide. You can telephone all over the world. They had to advertise these things, and not that long ago, the idea that you could in fact transcend space instantaneously with modern technology. And I think it's useful, again, to see these things because this is not that long ago, right? This is not like, ancient Mesopotamia. This is the 20th century. So that collapse of time and space also raises issues about our body and our self. Is our self always in our body? Can our self be someplace else, but our body be here? And this is one of the big complaints about cell phone use, right? You're not really here. You're there, wherever there is, right? And many of us have been in this situation, right, where you're talking to somebody and they're not hearing anything that you're saying because they're maybe texting with somebody else. And this would be a fun point to make a point about teenagers, except for that, the fact of the matter is that parents are doing it more than teenagers are, so I'm not going to go there. And I know because I've got teenagers and I'm the bad one. And I also know because research. So when you have body and self in the same time and place, then you can assume that people are accountable for their behavior, right? Because it was that body and they did it. And as soon as they get separated, it gets a little bit complicated, especially when we can have different identities in different places all over the internet. So we can be on LinkedIn being Mr. Professional Guy who's got lots of contacts who highly recommend me, and we can be over on Facebook being chatty person who just goes on and on and on about the kids and favorite recipes or biking to work every day. Or we can be on Twitter secretly trolling and attacking people for expressing their opinions and being really mean and rude and getting outed and maybe fired one day. We can have a lot of different, and meanwhile we can be over on Pinterest collecting all our gardening things, right? Oh, I just love this bouquet of flower arrangements. So which one is the real one when they start contradicting each other? Who's accountable? How do we decide where the boundaries are? Who gets to do what? Who gets blamed? Who's just having fun? Oh, no, I went too far. This, I think, is one of the most challenging boundaries, is that on the one hand, we get so much control with these technologies, and on the other hand, we get so controlled by them, right? So on the one hand, I can tell you I'm running late at the last minute. I can find out where my kid is all the time. There's nothing more infuriating than when people you like to surveil turn off their cell phone or they run out of battery and you feel like, wait, I don't get to control, I've lost control. You know, you're out somewhere in the world and I don't know exactly where and I can't tell you to come back or whatever. But on the other hand, by the same token, we're being seen all the time as well, and we're constantly accountable to others for our whereabouts and our activities. And that can be very constraining. And of course, in the context of big data and surveillance and the kinds of scales at which data is being collected about us, this is really transformed, even since the first edition of this book a few years ago. The boundary between interpersonal and mass communication gets blurred, so that what used to be maybe two friends chatting can suddenly become an international phenomenon, or a video log made for a few friends to watch can become really widely viewed. Or a personal message can become a front page newspaper sensation, right? So there's a lot of ways in which the boundaries between this used to be one-to-one and this used to be a mass message delivered to large groups is collapsed. And then finally, the boundary between public and private is very, very skewed in this environment. And it's skewed in ways, I think, so profound that I'm not even sure that privacy even works as a concept to begin to hold all the things that we want it to hold and to do all the work that we want it to do. I think that what's visible and what's invisible has just been strained to its limits, and we probably need some really profound rethinking of the very concept of public and private. So ultimately, what all of this means is that we're left with a situation where it's not really clear what's real. What's real and what's not real. The punchline here is, here you are, I've been all over the internet looking for you. The idea that we might go online, right? And yet, Internet of Things, right? My husband likes to turn the blender on and off with his cell phone. What's real and what's not? My son got a lot of credit on Facebook for having a dad who connected his blender to the Internet of Things. So against this backdrop, it makes a lot of sense that we would be worried about what is all this technology doing to our relationships. So maybe I'll just stop for a second and ask you guys, like, what are your concerns? What do you guys feel ambivalence about these technologies and what they're doing? Yeah.
I think it's like a lot of the different types of apps have changed the way that people date and like the social norms that people accept of what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and expectations.
Yeah, expectations around dating definitely changing. Yeah?
I find that at least my personal experience is that you make a lot of mistakes because how a particular type of communication, how effective it can be, is kind of hit or miss. So you know, early days of email, people thought, oh, this is great, and then there's so many misunderstandings because people didn't realize the limitations of the media and what wasn't there. Right? So we have natural unmediated communications that we grow up with and our brains are kind of tuned to. And then there's all these new ones, and it takes a while to figure out what you can and can't do with one particular thing. A lot of mistakes get made.
Yeah, so figuring out what are the norms for using this medium appropriately, and I'll get back to that in a minute too. Yeah.
I see my teenage kids constantly on their phones, and I'm concerned twofold. One is I'm afraid that they won't be able to communicate with other people outside of text messaging. You know, can they actually argue something? Can they put, you know, some logic behind what they're trying to say? And then on the other hand, I see some kind of obsession with it. It's like they can't be away from it. It's always about, oh, look what somebody Snapchatted, or look what somebody, you know, put out there, and they're always connected, and they feel that if they're not next to it, they're missing out on something. Whereas in the past, you'd be missing out if you weren't with other people, but now you're missing out if you're not next to your phone.
Classic fear, yeah, classic concern that a lot of people have, and often pointed at children or at teenagers, yeah.
On the other hand, though, I observe that same problem with my teenagers as well. But at the same time, there's also a commonality that I can bring to us as well. In a lot of instances, you might see, hey, we saw this interesting thing at school, but in the old days you couldn't look at it because it was in a textbook. But now they say, look at this, and you can then have a discussion around that thing. And so it does open up some doors of communication that were harder to come by as well. Yes.
Yes, and I think that's, and I love this back and forth because I think this is exactly the tension, right? Is on the one hand, there's this thing that might be happening that might be really bad. We might be being taken further from one another. It might be impairing our ability to really connect with one another. And on the other hand, wait, it might be a resource for connecting. It might be enabling, bringing new things into our interactions, or it might be offering common ground where there wasn't common ground. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, well, another concern. So in the olden times of using it or feeling it, but it used to be kind of compartmentalized. So
Okay, wait, I just have to say, I love that we're saying olden times like Usenet and FidoNet, okay? Back in the old days, yes? It was compartmentalized.
So there's some people you talk here and some people you talk there, so you can kind of talk feeling it's very much that those people are going to see what you say there, right? And the second thing, it's been ephemeral. So it's got some people read it, reply to it, but eventually disappears. Now everything is saved, everything is archived somewhere, you can search for it.
Yes, yes. So these concerns, I would say, are about collapsed context, the idea that people can see what you should have said to these people over here, now they're going to see it over there, and the persistence and searchability of it, yeah.
So I'm wondering what my kid is doing and with whom and what are the communications when he's in front of a screen all day.
Yeah.
But then I realized that when I was his age, I was out with my friends interacting in a different medium, but my parents had no idea what I was doing or saying, or even where I was. At least with my kid, I physically know where he is and that he's not in any immediate physical danger, and I don't have to, make sure he's home in time for dinner because he's right there.
And that's the controlled problem right there, right? Is I don't have control, I don't know what my kid's doing, but I know where he is, right? So, yeah.
I have to say, on the plus side, I have one child who's very reserved, and I find it's actually helped her social life because it's much easier for her to text and quick things, and so she actually has more social interaction. But there is an addictive quality that particularly the other one has that just scares me. But I recently saw a cartoon or something that had a bunch of people all sitting around on their phones, and then next to it, a picture of people on a subway car, everyone in their newspaper.
In their newspaper, yeah.
So, I don't know if it's really,
yeah.
There's some things that really aren't, aspects that aren't new.
Right, you guys couldn't be better plants. And this is, that's perfect. I'm going to stop right here because that's just exactly where I want to go next, is that we tend to think of this as, this is a thing that this new technology is doing to us, right? And we're these helpless victims of this new technology that's come along and is damaging our children or is addictive and taking our power away from us. And yet, at the same time, these are, in fact, concerns that have been raised about almost every technology, and I have some amazing examples in a second. It's a two-way street, right? These technologies are taken up in very different ways in different cultures. They arise out of cultures. We know that being at Microsoft, right? Microsoft came out of a very particular time and place, and the products that were created were not like manna from heaven, ta-da, arising fully formed. It took people, right, embedded in social situations to create these things, and they bear the legacies of that, and they change in response to how people use them. So I want to focus on three particular fears, which I think have gotten addressed here. One being, are our interactions worse? Is it harder to have conversations now? That's a concern that Sherry Turkle raises. You've just raised this about young people. Are our relationships damaged? Are we having inferior relationships? We're less able to connect and feel close to others. And finally, are we substituting some kind of virtual interaction for a real interaction? Are we substituting having our phone for being with other people? And these are concerns that As Andre said, I started looking at these things in 1990. People weren't talking about them so much then, but by 94, when AOL merged with the rest of the internet and suddenly the public was online, I did a study. I talk about it in the book of letters to Ann Landers and Dear Abby. And when they start showing up in the mid-1990s, it's all, oh, it's so fun. It's so fun. There's some great quotes in there. So let's start with this question of quality. Are the interactions worse, right? So this is a study I love. 40% of the messages are pointless babble. Well, how do you determine that 40% of Twitter is pointless babble? You create a category called pointless babble, and anything you don't see the point of, you put it in there. Ta-da! But very old concern. Here we have it in 1927 about telephones. Hold the line a minute, dear. I'm trying to think what I have on my mind. 1927. And it goes back even further than that, right? And it goes back even further than that. This is what Socrates had to say about the alphabet. He's quoting an Egyptian, it's Plato quoting Socrates, quoting an Egyptian goddess, so make of it what you will, but this discovery of yours will create forgetfulness. The discovery is the alphabet. Will create forgetfulness in the listeners' souls because they will not use their memories. They will trust to the external written characters and not remember of themselves. The specific which you have discovered is an aid not to memory, but to reminiscence. And you give your disciples not truth, but only the semblance of truth. They will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing. They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing. They will be tiresome company, having the show of wisdom without the reality. That doesn't sound anything like things people say now, does it? I'll let y'all finish taking your pictures before I go away. It's a good one, isn't it? You gotta love this. I mean, this is like 350 BCE, right? And you see it all there. You see it's gonna appear to be reality, but it's not really reality. People are going to be tiresome. This technology is damaging our relationships. And it seems so absurd now to imagine seeing the alphabet and writing as that kind of threat. But it was. And one can argue, actually, it did damage orality. Is that where you were going with that?
I don't have any of the Odyssey memorized. I'm terrible at that stuff.
Thank goodness. We filled it up with so much more varied stuff. But yes, this is true. We have lost ways of memory. We have lost ways of remembering. Now, that may or may not be a problem, but it was a realistic concern, right? Whether or not we've all become tiresome company who know nothing, that may be an extrapolation. So I got really interested in this question of what do people think about the quality of their communication? I did a study with undergrads at the University of Kansas, a large Midwestern university, as we call it in the social science research literature. And I asked them, in general, how do you feel about communicating face-to-face or on the phone or on the internet? And they wrote things like, oh, face-to-face is best because I can see them and I can hear them. And the telephone is next because at least I can hear their tone of voice. And the internet is worse because it's really hard to read people. And I don't have a sense of their feelings or anything like that. And it came out like it was a script, like these people had all had this drilled into them in grade school or something, although they hadn't, right? So you think, oh, wow, that sounds really sincere. I also asked them to think of the most recent conversation that they had had, and they got different versions of the survey that manipulated whether they were asked to remember one face-to-face or online or on the phone, and whether it was with a friend or a family member or an acquaintance or a romantic partner. And then I had them evaluate the quality of that particular conversation. So you would think from this whole, oh, face-to-face is so awesome, and then the phone is okay, and then the internet is the worst, you might end up with something like this, right? Where, oh, this is perfection, face-to-face is here, and phone is there, and oh, that poor little internet is merely mediocre. This would be generous. But what it actually looked like was not like this. What it actually looked like is this. So again, this is a perfect conversation. Face-to-face came in at 3.94, phone call at 3.99, and the internet at 3.75, which is to say First of all, the phone was the best. And statistically, the phone was different from the other two, but the other two were not different from one another.
So does that comparison actually take into account the fact that face-to-face communication takes more effort to arrange? People may have to travel, that may make that to be negative. Well, I don't know.
Well, no, I mean, what all that this says is think of the most recent voluntary face-to-face conversation you had.
That factor. Okay.
Okay, so it's the most recent one. So what you see here is this is actually a pretty common finding that the use of the phone is really related to intimacy. If you think about it, you probably have voice calls with very few people on any regular basis. There's work from Telenor, the Norwegian telecom company, showing that most people have voice phone calls with 5 or fewer people regularly. So those are the people that we're really close to. The internet, yeah, it was statistically not as awesome as the phone, but it was still pretty darn high quality conversation. But this suggests that maybe we're romanticizing face-to-face a little bit. Yeah?
This is say about the quality of the medium, right? It may be highly correlated to why they use phone. So you mentioned that usually people use phone calls to talk to close friends and family.
It does account for the relationship. It does control for relationship, what kind of relationship, because we had 4. And in fact, what we found is that by far the best predictor of low quality conversations, this is my advice to you, if you want to ensure only having high quality conversations, do not talk to acquaintances. That's by far the best predictor of how good your conversation is. It matters who you're talking to. That's all that matters in a lot of ways is who are you talking to, right? The medium we work through. And I'll have more to say about that in a minute. Okay, so let's talk about the quality of relationships. Are we having damaged relationships? Are the relationships not as good if we're dating online? Is that messing up romance? Well, that's kind of a whole nother kettle of fish, because is somebody you met online capable of being as good a partner as somebody you met face-to-face? Or is it inauthentic? Is it inadequate? Is it somehow impoverished? So again, if we go back to thinking about those Kansas kids and those relationships that they had conversations in, I also asked them, in this relationship, what percentage of your communication would you say you do in each of these 3 media? So that you could sort of say, well, this person talks on the phone with this person a lot more than they see him face-to-face. And this relationship is much more face-to-face than it is internet, and so on. And what we found there, and I don't want to get lost in the numbers, but the main thing that we find is that when you look at relational satisfaction and relational closeness, all of the correlations with face-to-face, telephone, and internet are all positive. And I'm giving you the examples from my own research, but the book has a lot of other studies that support these same kinds of perspectives. So you don't see that face-to-face and telephone are positively associated with satisfaction and closeness, but the internet is not. You see that the internet is also positively related. And of course, these are people they chose to have a conversation with. It was a voluntary conversation, right? And they're not statistically different. I also did some research on the website Last.fm, which is like a social network for music listening. And that had the nice quality that when you loaded it, your friends showed up in random order. So I worked with the people on the site to do a survey. And people would bring up their profile, they'd take the first friend, and they would fill out a big survey about this friend. So how did they know each other face-to-face? How far away did they live? Did they have an age difference? Those kinds of questions. And then also, how many different ways did they communicate? And a 18-item scale that measured how close they were. And what we found was that, for any of you stats geeks, it was a multiple regression analysis. And what we found was that the factor that erased all of the other variables and that accounted for 65% of the difference in quality of relationship was how many media they used to communicate. So what I'm saying is, each medium they used, they got a 1/4 point closer on this relational development scale. And each one of those media contributed to closeness. So rather than seeing that one is less associated with closeness or another is more, what you see is that the closer you get to somebody, the more ways you communicate. And then you can think about the phone, right? And oh yeah, but surely all this texting, these texting relationships cannot be good. This calling people on the phone cannot be good. We should be sitting in the park chilling out, and instead we have to be in communication. I did another survey at Kansas where we surveyed people about the person that they use their phone with most, their mobile phone with most. And this is a map showing what we found, and I won't go into a whole lot of details, but what I want to summarize for you is that using the phone together created expectations that they would use the phone to maintain the relationship. If they never used the phone together, they wouldn't expect each other to. But the fact of using the phone creates an expectation that you're going to keep using the phone to communicate with each other. And on the one hand, this creates a sense of interdependence. We rely on one another. We're connected to one another. And that increases the satisfaction in the relationship. Right? The phone brings us closer because we're more dependent on one another. But at the same time, it also creates a sense of overdependence and of being trapped, which makes us less satisfied with our relationship. So they're both happening at the same time. We're simultaneously feeling closer to our friends because of our phone relationship and feeling trapped and less satisfied. I think that's really the crux of the matter, is that it's both. This is the Sherry Turkle concern. What about using the phone together? You're with somebody and you're on the phone. That can't be good. These are all Flickr Creative Commons licensed images, by the way. So another study that we did last year, this was published, we asked people, we searched the literature and newspapers, and remember a couple of years ago there was a huge row about somebody talking on the phone while buying something at a store in England, and it was all over the internet. You know, I think that there was a video and the cashier went crazy and they were like, she's right, it's an injustice, it's horrible. One of those viral things. So what we did was we collected a list of norms about cell phones, like, you know, don't cuss when you're out in public on your phone, or when you're having a conversation with somebody, don't look at your phone. Those kinds of things. We came up with a list of them and we gave them to pairs, and we said, on a scale of 1 to 5, do you think this is a rule in your peer group? On a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree that this ought to be a rule? How much do you follow these rules when you're with your partner? And how much does your partner follow these rules when they're with you? So and then we had the whole quality of relationship scales. So the idea is that you can sort of see, well, does this mean that the people who don't follow the rules have bad relationships, like we always hear all the time? This is what people are always telling us. I was called on the call-in radio incredibly naive and ignorant for thinking that in restaurants not everybody is on their phones all the time. I actually started thinking, everybody's always on their phones in restaurants. I'm like, actually, that's not really true. Yes, it is. You're so ignorant. You're so naive. Right? I started looking in restaurants. It's like at any given moment, there's like one table where there's a couple of people on the phone. And that table moves around, right? But at any moment, most people are not on their phones. But these guys both are, which they found entertaining enough to photograph. So what we found was that following the social norms had absolutely no relationship to the quality of that relationship. Absolutely none. What did affect relational quality was if was following the norms that you personally held dear. So to oversimplify, that might be like, if you're the kind of person who doesn't really think it's important to have a lot of eye contact in conversation because you know you're intimate and you don't really need to prove it, and your partner is also that way, you're fine. But if you're not, if you're that way and your partner isn't, if you're not looking me in the eye, you don't love me norm, then you've got a clash. Right? So what this shows is being similar to one another, having the same norms is more important. But also, it's following the norms yourself that matters. It's not just having your partner follow them, it's you yourself following them. It's messier than that, but that's the short version I'll give you. Last concern, Are we substituting fake relationships for real relationships? Are we substituting mediated relationships for face-to-face relationships? As the woman over there said with the photo of people on the train, this is a really old concern, right? This is, I think, 1954. I think this one is. So here you have the woman daydreaming of the romantic dinner while her husband keeps his nose in the paper. My 15-year-old said, yesterday I was teasing my 15-year-old, I said, hey, let's spend some quality time and have a conversation. You know, the kind we used to have before cell phones ruined our relationships. And he said, oh, Mom, cell phones didn't ruin our relationships. You would have just been looking at the paper. Okay. So that last FM study where I asked everybody how many ways do you communicate with each other is, to the best of my knowledge, still the only study that has actually started with the relationship and said, how many ways do you communicate and how does that affect how close you are? And again, I don't want you to get lost in the weeds of this table. I just want to show you these are all the different media that we asked them about and their correlations with one another. And the main point here is that there's no negative signs. Using any one medium makes you more likely to use another medium. So face-to-face, communicating face-to-face was positively related to all of the other means of communicating, except for communicating via Last.fm. So, there you go. This is a phenomenon called media multiplexity, that the closer you are, the more media you use to communicate. So I think that's really important, right? Because it means we're talking additive here. We're not talking substitution. And when we hear fears like, oh, no, they're texting, they can't have conversations, we're substituting Facebook for real friendship, we're doing a grave injustice to our understanding of ourselves. Because, in fact, we're doing both. Okay, so what I take from this is that conventional wisdom and research disagree. And which side do we want to be on? We're all for research, right? So what I've been covering comes out of my own research, which I wanted to highlight in part because I am in-house, and it might be useful to some of you to know, well, what kind of research skills do I bring? But the book covers a very wide range of research from the last 20, 30 years that covers these things. And by and large, most of these assumptions that people have about harm do not hold up very well, just as they haven't held up especially well for prior media. That said, I'm not one of those people who says, technology is fantastic, it solves all our problems, it's great, rah, rah, rah. It does come with complications. It does disrupt norms. It does make patterns that were taken for granted questionable and create new patterns that we might find questionable. There's huge questions of etiquette that we have not begun to resolve, of how to be a polite and civil person with your devices when other people are around, or how to behave through these technologies in ways that are civil and polite. And we've seen a lot of, I don't know if you guys saw the essay going around the other day by Umair Haque saying Twitter is dying and it's because of abuse, it's because we've built all these technologies and nobody's paid attention to treating one another nicely and ensuring that we treat one another nicely. A perspective, but a valid perspective in the sense that there is a lot of abuse, there is a lot of meanness, there is a lot of nastiness, there are a lot of problems that arise around these technologies. So etiquette is one set of these problems. The pressure to use them when you want to be free of them is certainly, so that I take the point about feeling anxious when you're not near your phone. I wouldn't want to say it's only true of youth, because I certainly see a lot of adults on my Facebook and Twitter going, I left the house without my phone today. I'm always sort of relieved when I find I've left the phone without my house. Like, oh, a day free from pressure. I left my phone at home. That pressure is very, very real and is a problem, right? And then you get into these questions of data collection that I feel personally very concerned about. The fact that so much of our social interaction has shifted onto media that are privately owned or that are publicly held, but that are for-profit corporations, and they're mining our personal interactions in order to maximize profit and to sell us stuff, which I think is a very, very problematic conflation of interpersonal connection and the sacredness of human connection and capitalism and selling and just because we can get the data we should kind of thinking. That I would hope that we as a company could think more about that and have more to say about it. But that said, despite the complications, despite the concerns that are raised, the company here is mixed but sociable. Whatever the internet is doing, whatever these technologies are doing, they are not making us less social. I think the research from the last 20, 30 years has consistently, in case after case, this is not to say there are no counterexamples, right? There are people who will argue this. Some of us might say some of their data is somewhat cherry-picked. Some of us might quibble with the methods. But by and large, the body of research as a whole suggests that people are not getting less social because of these technologies. They're getting more social because of these technologies. So what to do about this? I thought I'd finish up with just some recommendations about what do you do with this kind of information. And the first thing is think about that cell phone study showing that if you are not following your own norms in the relationship, then you're less satisfied with the relationship. One way we create good relationships is by being clear on what are the standards that I have for technology use in this relationship, both in terms of in my communication with this person through technology, but also in terms of in my use of technology when this person is around. What are the standards that I value, and am I living up to them? Because we always tend to seem to start with, you're doing it wrong, especially if you are a teenager. We love pointing our fingers at teenagers. And the research consistently shows that teenagers are way less bad than grown-ups on almost all of this stuff, right? As much as grown-ups blame, it's sort of like teenagers are this mirror where we look in them and we see all the things we don't like about ourselves and blame them. So are we living up to our own standards? This is one that we hardly ever do because we don't actually have a whole lot of conversations about our relationships in general with our partners, but I recommend that people have explicit conversations about how do I feel about the way you use the phone? How do you want me to use the phone? Do you like it when I call you? You were saying, it's hard to know which medium to use. People are different, right? Sometimes it really helps just to say, are you a phone person or would you rather text? Do you want me to email? Do you want me to call? What works for you, right? Because people do have very different preferences. And when we're not clear on those differences, we start blaming them for things that they did that were, maybe that was what worked best for them, right? Like I've got a colleague who's all about long emails, right? And I'm all about, you're down the hall, just talk to me, right? And that causes a lot of conflict, but then you can have those explicit conversations and at least you learn that the problem is not that it's not a problem between you, it's a mismatch, right? It's a mismatch, not a dislike, put it that way. Given that these are concerns that have come up with technology after technology after technology, as somebody who is very concerned with people having high-quality relationships and holding on to that desire that we have to have that kind of personal connection with other people, and having consistently found in the research that new technologies are not actually destroying our relationships, I would say, hey, if we're really concerned about our relationships, let's think about what are the underlying structures, what are the underlying causes that are causing relational conflict, right? And sometimes it's that we don't actually get along very well. It's not about the technology at all, it's about the people. Lots of times it's about these larger social structures, like the fact that we all have to work all the time and our colleagues and employers expect us to be available after hours to work even more, right? Lots of times when mom's on the playground looking at her phone, mom is talking to her boss or her colleague or her client or something like that. So we need to think about how do we as society support healthy relationships if that's what we really want, instead of going, ooh, phone bad, which is a lot easier, way easier, and always a preferred strategy. I don't know if you guys know about the famous comic book study or the commission to look into comic books that said that the reason that there was so much youth crime was because of comic books. Okay, and then finally, as a technology company, I think we can be pushing for technologies that don't just say, yay, technology is great, it lets people connect, but that think seriously about the kind of conflicts that technology causes in relationships, the inevitable ways that technology pushes us in some directions, pulls us in others, and push for technologies that allow people to manage those competing demands of relationships. I think by and large, most tech companies, this goes back to your concern about things being isolated and not being that. Most tech companies think that if you know somebody in one place, you want to know them everywhere, right? And it's all about, and it makes sense because, of course, if you're thinking from a data perspective, if we can get all that data in one place, if we've got your whole social graph, then we know so much about you and we can totally serve up the ads you want, right? But we might not want those people in the same place, as one example, right? There's a lot of ways in which we might want to manage. And I think, there are ways in which technologies are getting more sensitive to these needs. But it's something we have to keep pushing for, because I think at the same time that you have a public that often says, oh, these technologies are harming our relationships so much, you also have tech companies that say the solution to all of society's problems is the right technology, right? And that's unfortunately just as misguided, right? There's an in-between there, which is technologies can help, technologies can harm. We have to be conscious, we have to be iterative, we have to be aware of unintended consequences that technologies have, and we have to keep paying attention to how they're being used once they get out there. Yes?
When you talk about the competing demands in relationships, have you looked at what those are generationally? So for how that's for young kids versus, because I can only understand it from my perspective, what are the demands of what I'm in, but I don't understand it for someone that's a teenager or middle school student. How have we looked at how that's different? Or are they the same?
That's a great question. I think the demands in relationships depend a tremendous amount on the contexts that we're in. So they do differ a lot by age group. So when I think about people, say, in middle school, they are constantly immersed in their peer group, right? And by the time you're in our age, we may like our colleagues a lot, but we don't spend all our time with our peer group, right? So that's a huge difference that's going to change the tensions around our relationships and the uses of technology right there. So if you look at cyberbullying, for example, it's almost all an extension of in-school bullying. It's not this radical, weird phenomenon that's happening out there. Whereas if you look at bullying among adults, I'm not sure that would hold, that it's the same people we're with all day who are the ones being mean to us online. So that might be one example of change. But you also see variation amongst different populations. So for example, I just edited a special issue of a journal about selfies. And one of the articles in there was by somebody who had done research in a favela in Brazil, and he was looking at the way that the teenagers there used selfies. And they were using selfies as a way of saying, look, Mom, I'm okay, right? And as a way of saying, hey, guys, I'm participating in social life, but I'm not going to say anything that could get me in trouble with anyone, right? Because there's no words. It's just me smiling, right? So that's a really different use of a selfie to control a really different set of pressures from what it might mean for my 15-year-old son to post a selfie, which might be like, hey, I'm looking good, aren't I? Right? Maybe there, with selfies and teens, we tend to go for the vanity and narcissism explanation, right? Which I don't actually think it does apply, but it could apply in some context, but it certainly doesn't work in the favela, right? That's not what's going on there at all. So it's always really important to dissociate the particular form of the medium or the use of the medium from what does it mean in that particular context to those people, right? And you're going to see a lot of, even amongst teens, you're going to see variation by cohorts. So that's basically all I got for you. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and talk about this more. I believe we have some time, so yes?
I had an interesting question or sort of observation, a research question, really to see if you can point me to further research on it. Maybe it's in the book. It's on the notion of media multiplicity, and you're showing how they're additive, right? So clearly one isn't taking away from the other. So I'm curious if there's any work on the what can you or can you not communicate through these different media? Because it seems like if people are ganging up and using multiple modes for people they're most intimate with, then they're having multiple forms of communication.
Which things are they doing?
Yeah,
Which modes?
Correct. And what are the consequences if you were to artificially subtract some of the modes that really would be best fitting, but for some reason they're not available? Like, say, distance between people who want to talk face to face.
I would say that in general, there's a unfortunate lack of research, like I was just saying, that starts with the person or the relationship and says across all these different possible modes, what are you doing and what's working? They tend to go, what are people doing on this? How are people using Facebook? How are people using Twitter? How are people using Snapchat? So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of crosscuts like that. That said, there certainly some stuff we know, like the cell phone. There's a lot of research talking about micro-coordination and how useful it is for those little things like running late, be there in 10 minutes, right? Which it doesn't make a lot of sense to go to somebody's house and say face-to-face, right? Or even necessarily to call. It can be easier to text. There's research, including by people in our MSR Cambridge lab, ye olde Cambridge, about Skype and the centrality of Skype in maintaining long-distance romantic relationships and immigrant relationships between people who've left the country and people who stayed behind. So clearly, audio video is much better for intimate relationship maintenance over distance in a way that other media aren't. But in terms of sort of a systematic, here's a table, here's what's good for what.
Yeah, I'm just curious, because if you look at some completely mediated activities, say open source software development collaboration activities, they've evolved into a certain culture because the communication media was limited to a certain type. So the interaction models that have evolved in order to do that are ones that don't require channels that weren't there. Whereas if you look at, say, the workplace, where we may try to replicate group team building and working collaboratively together, but we'll try and do it across geographies with webcams and that sort of thing, we're trying to take a face-to-face thing and augment it. And it may be, from a workplace perspective, it seems like having a better understanding of what's likely to work and what's likely to not. And say, okay, well, we will switch our norms to this because we need everybody to be working together, and that's not possible under these constraints. So we'll eliminate the ones that have that. So,
Yeah.
I've just run into a lot of that sort of cyber tribalism, where you've got like one group of people who work together and another group of people work together. I refer to it in my own work as two tribes on a wire.
I like that,
The things that go wrong there.
Yeah.
So I've encountered the problem a lot, and I'm just curious now that you're
here. Well, there is, in the field of organizational communication, there's work going back, and in fact, the earliest work on computer-mediated communication was, when do we need to get people together for in-person, and when can we get away with a teleconference, and when will a phone call do? And that generally suggests that it's related to ambiguity, that the more ambiguity there is and the more right solutions there are, the more face-to-face helps. I hope I'm getting that right. It's in the book. There's trade-offs, right? There's trade-offs. If you want everybody's voice to get on the table, then anonymous can be more important than in person, where some people are going to be cowed into silence and some people are going to talk all the time. So there are quite a few factors to weigh there. But at the same time, I think your point about the open source community evolving norms to manage working with the constraints that they had is really important, because what that says is that if you give humans a task to do and you say here, or if humans decide we want to do this task together, and a limited medium is the only thing they have to do it in, instead of saying, oh, can't do it, they'll figure out how, right? So it's not always clear to me that there is a one-to-one match between what you want to get done and which medium is going to be best, and that all of the people who are going to be involved in that task are going to agree that that's the right medium for that job. So it might be that maybe for you, Skype would work perfectly for this task, but for those people, they get all flustered in Skype meetings and they don't remember what they wanted to say until it's over, and it would work so much better for them if they could do it via email where they have the time to really write out their thoughts, right? So I guess I kind of go back to the having conversations about what works instead of just assuming that what you're feeling about it or what they're feeling about it is what is. Other questions or comments or punching matches ready to get going? Nice to see you. All right. Thanks so much for coming. I appreciate it.